All right, welcome back. Now we're going to start getting into the meat of this model. So we're going to look at the decision to work and how much to work. We assume that an individual will choose to work a combination of consumption and leisure that will maximize their utility. This seems like a strong assumption, but it really isn't. From the outside, it may seem like an individual is not maximizing their utility when you look at their choices, because from your own perspective, it seems like something you would not choose to do. So for instance, my go-to example is my dad loves Little Caesars pizza, and he prefers it to other pizza, like actually good pizza. To me, it looks like he's not maximizing utility, and he's choosing something inferior. But for his preferences, however messed up they are in this case, he's choosing the best option. Likewise, we may think someone is crazy for working long hours without a break, but for them, it's the best option. Or we may see someone choosing not to work at all, and we think that's crazy, when in reality, given their enjoyment of consumption versus leisure, it's the best mix for them. So to determine what is the optimal mix of consumption and leisure, we're going to combine the two graphs that we've worked with so far into one. So we'll include the indifference curves and the budget line. These will tell us what is best for each individual worker. Remember, at every point along the indifference curve, a person is indifferent or does not care about the combination they choose. They're just as good. So we need more than just the indifference curve to figure out what an individual is going to do. So we include the budget constraint line. And since it's a line and it's being, working with a curve, it's going to work out well for us. Because at one certain point, the budget line is going to cross the indifference curve at just one location, which we call a tangent. At that point, the individual cannot increase their utility through any other combination. That's going to be the best combination for them. So let's turn to an example and see it visually so it actually makes sense. So here we have a graph to illustrate what's going on. We're combining our budget line, our budget constraint, with indifference curves. So the line FE is the budget line, which takes into account the individual's wages and their non-labor income. The indifference curve U star is the best indifference curve for this individual. So we can see that the budget line is tangent to the indifference curve U star at this point P that the arrow is pointing to. The indifference curve to the right, so U1, is the best level of utility on this map of any of the curves that we've drawn, excuse me. So this U1 would be even better than U star, where we're at. But the entire indifference curve lies beyond the budget line. So in this current situation, reaching U1 is impossible. Point P is the farthest right that individual can go based on this budget line. So that's the mix of leisure and consumption that they're going to choose. The amount of leisure and labor is shown on the x-axis. So this individual will choose 70 hours of leisure, which corresponds to 40 hours of labor. At point P, they're also going to choose $500 worth of consumption. Now, if you tried to move up or down the budget constraint line, you would end up on indifference curves below this indifference curve U star. So it's going to provide less satisfaction. So is the person chosen to be on U0, or if the person, I don't want to say that. Yeah, if the person chose to be on U0, they could choose point A because that lies along that indifference curve, U0. The problem is they'll be giving up satisfaction with nothing to make up for it. That's why it was so confusing. I had to try to say this. That's not something that they would choose to do. They could also choose to work 0 hours at point E and live off their non-labor income. They would be indifferent between these two states, between point A and then that point E down there. So they would end up pushing out to the next indifference curve, all the way out till they got to U star, where that's their best possible combination to maximize their utility. So now what we're going to do is walk through some examples of what happens when we change the conditions to see its impact on individuals' behavior. So this is some of the good stuff we get to do with the model. If we increase the non-labor income, that's going to change the placement of the budget line. The slope isn't going to change, but we'll be shifting it up if we increase the amount of money, or shifting it down if we decrease the amount of money. So it could be, in this case, we're shifting upwards. We're increasing the endowment points, or the amount of non-labor income. Let's say someone invested in NVIDIA 10 years ago or Apple 40 years ago. Could be a sudden inheritance, or it could be winning the lottery, or maybe it's some kind of bonus at work. Whatever it is, it's a one-time payment that's not contingent on the hours worked. So assuming this change is not happening at the same time as a change in wages too, so if we're going to hold wages constant, which is a pretty reasonable assumption, what's going to happen here? First is that the entire budget line is going to shift upwards. So we're going to move from line E0 to line E1. It's going to shift upwards until that point E1 is in line with their total non-labor income. Remember, point E1, the individual is not working at all, so their only income is from their non-labor income. In this example, they went from earning $100 in non-labor income to $200 in non-labor income. So originally, the individual is on budget line E0 and the utility curve U0. The tangent point for that is P0. That's where the budget line is tangent to the indifference curve. So at that point, they're going to choose 70 hours of leisure and looks like $200 in consumption. But what happens after the increase in non-labor income? As they move the budget line up from E0 to E1, that allows them to move out to a farther indifference curve. So they'll get more utility from their consumption leisure decision. In this case, they're going to choose point P1, which is, again, that tangent point between the budget line and the indifference curve. This is going to be the best combination for them. At this point, they can enjoy more leisure time than 80 hours, which is great. They'll also be able to spend more money on consuming goods. So the textbook doesn't give a number, but just from guesstimating, it looks like it's about $300 in consumption they'll be able to spend. So this slide notes that this is if leisure is a normal good. By normal good, we mean that as someone makes a higher income, they're going to want to engage in more leisure, no matter how much they receive. That more leisure is always a good thing. But some people can get bored after a while. So imagine a day or a week on the beach. It's great. But what if you did that every day for a year? Eventually, it may start to get boring. As hard as it sounds to you, someone working full-time and taking classes. Or think about time on social media. 5 minutes is great. 45 minutes starts to get a little much. By 5 hours, it's probably hard to continue. Or a pizza, 1 slice is great. 5 slices is great and fills you up. 5 whole pies really starts to hurt and you have to struggle through it if for some reason you're involved in an eating contest where you have to eat 5 pizzas. Eventually, any good thing can start to turn into a chore. So if people start to get bored of leisure over time, then eventually it becomes less and less valuable. The indifference curves will look slightly different than our last example. They're still not going to cross each other. They can't do that, so we're still following the rules. But they won't line up perfectly either. So we see the example here where the curve U1 looks slightly different than it did on the previous slide. So what happens when non-labor income increases for this person? Well, the budget line shifts upwards in the exact same way. It's the exact same change in the endowment or the non-labor income that we saw before. The only difference is how the utility or the indifference curves play out. So the new tangent point along this new budget line is going to be different. So this person's P1, their new best optimal decision between work and leisure is going to be different. It's going to be left of P0. So they're going to have fewer hours of leisure. In this case, 60 hours. They're going to end up working more so that they can consume more. So in this example, their consumption is even higher than consumption was on the previous slide. Now, when it comes to assignments and exams, I don't want you to worry too much. I'm not going to ask you to, I'm not going to give you a very, very vague question and say, all right, now draw these functions and without giving you any information about whether consider leisure a normal good or an inferior good. I'm not going to expect you to just read my mind about how to draw these indifference curves. I will either explicitly tell you, give you all the curves and have you work it out, or if for some reason I don't mention it, I will, again, put in the instructions for the question that just tell me if you were going to assume that utility is a normal good or a inferior good. Not utility, I'm sorry, leisure. The basic idea being, I don't expect you to be masterminds of working with this function. The whole reason why we're using this model is just to explore some changes or how these changes affect individuals' decision-making process. So I want you to, it's more of getting the general idea than it is memorizing every single part, because you're not going to be an economist, but you are going to need to know some of these ideas in the background as you're working in human resources. Very fine line, but I'm not going to expect too much. So I don't want you to worry now as you're seeing all these figures and all these slides and even some equations creeping in. So now we're going to look at a different type of change. This is going to be what happens when the hourly wage changes. And we're going to look at the same two scenarios. But unlike before, the point E, the endowment point, the non-labor income doesn't change. The wage is changing, so the slope is going to change, but it's going to rotate around that same point E. So for this worker, each hour of work increases their income or their ability to consume even more than before. So each hour of labor increases the ability to consume. Now, how is this going to affect their decision to work? One of two things can happen. For some, if you make even more money, then they'd want to work even more. I wouldn't, so pick up an extra shift or teach an extra class for $100 total. But if WVU offered me like $10,000 or something extreme for an additional night class, I would be more than happy to work the longer hours. In that case, it would be worth it, where it wouldn't be worth it for just $100. We call that the substitution effect. That work is a better substitute for leisure because now it's relatively more valuable. You're getting more out of it. Or you could think of it the opposite way. Leisure is relatively more expensive. Instead of giving up $100 for that leisure, I'm giving up $10,000. I'm using this extreme example to really highlight the decision going on. Typically, workers aren't given that sort of extreme decision. So on the other hand, we can see what happens in this example. Now, this person has an increased hourly wage. They have an increase in demand for all normal goods because they earn more. Leisure is included as a normal good in this example. So they can make more money, but they also reduce some of their working hours so they can consume more leisure. Let's actually walk through what we see. The budget line turns like it's on a hinge at the endowment point E to represent the increase in the hourly wage. So now we're on a different, steeper budget curve than before. So we can reach a newer, better indifference curve, U1, where the worker has even more utility. So in this case, we move from point P to point R, which is the new tangent point. Point R has more hours of leisure, but it also is higher on the y-axis, so the individual can consume more as well. So they're consuming more goods, but they're also consuming more leisure, or enjoying more leisure. So we can see visually that they cut back on the hours worked, or they increase the hours of leisure in this example because they're able to make more, but they're still able to consume more than before. Now, here's the other possibility. This person wants to experience even greater consumption power, even more than they enjoy the leisure. So in this case, the indifference curve is a little bit higher, a little bit farther back. We have the same hinge action going on here. The slope changes because the hourly wage increases. But we end up in a different spot because the indifference curve U1 has a different slope from before. We still go to the tangent point. In this case, it's labeled point R just like before. But point R corresponds with a much higher consumption than before and results in fewer hours of leisure. So for this individual, the extra consumption that they can afford is so much more valuable to them that they give up the potential leisure. Before, they gave up $10 every time they took off an hour leisure when they were on this line, because the slope is $10 per hour. But now, with this new higher wage, you now have to give up $20 for each hour of leisure. And for this worker, it's just not worth it. So should we work at all? Some people would say, well, yes, of course. But we kind of assumed so far that the person would work, that they were working and they would continue to want to work in our previous example. But people can choose to not work. So this graph looks a lot more complex because we're looking at two different people. So look at the indifference curve, U0 to start. It goes right through point E, or the endowment point. Remember, the endowment point is where the individual does not work. They work 0 hours and they only enjoy their non-labor income, but they end up with a lot of leisure because they're not working. So this graph has two budget lines, GE and HE. So HE has higher wages and GE has lower wages. So here's HE with the higher wage with the greater slope. Here is GE with the lower wages because it has the lower slope. So imagine the low-wage individual is a clerk at a gas station, while the high-wage individual is a high-powered Wall Street. They're going to have different utility functions and different budget lines. So now we can consider the separate budget lines. Since they're in different places, we can think about the two separate and difference curves. So let's start with the clerks with the low-wage budget line. At no point is it better, or do they receive more utility than on curve U0. So here is curve U0 that goes through the endowment point. Down here, we have the example of another utility curve. In this case, the farthest out that the low-wage individual, this clerk, can get on the utility curve or the indifference curve to maximize their utility is right here at point E, where they're choosing to work 0 hours and just live off their non-labor income. So that's what the clerk is going to choose to do. But now things are a little bit different for a Wall Street firm. They earn a lot more and they have much higher hourly wages. So utility curve UH is tangent to the budget line way farther to the right. So right here, sticking out farther from U0. The tangent point for them here is point Y. So what they're going to choose to do is engage in less leisure. They're moving back this way. They're also going to engage in a lot more consumption, so up higher on here because they're choosing to work. So that's why if you've ever seen the movie Margin Call, Kevin Spacey's character goes against his conscience and stays with the investment bank at the end of the movie. He says he needs the money because he wanted more consumption. He wanted that big house, expensive car. He spent it all, so he needs the money. That provides a lot more utility from quitting or retiring and keeping his I guess he doesn't really have much conscience to protect at this point in his career. Well, the actor and the character, but I meant the character. But anyway, getting back to this, for the lower wage worker, it can make more sense to not work entirely, but it did not make sense for the high-powered Wall Street type. Now, I'm going to briefly touch on what we call the backwards bending supply curve. So basically, right above the reservation wage, the labor supply curve is positively sloped, meaning that more money leads to more hours worked and less leisure. But after a while, at high enough wages, people begin to be willing to work less and consume less so that they can enjoy more leisure. So here we see the supply curve sloping backwards. So starting out, this bottom part of the curve, as wages increase from 10 to 13 to 20, workers are more than happy to work more hours. It's worth it. But eventually, at a high enough wage, they start to cut back on their hours worked and enjoy more leisure. It becomes relatively more valuable. Now, in our supply and demand models, we're going to work at the supply curve that slopes upwards, just like we saw in that brief example in the introductory chapter. Part of that is we want to keep things simple. The other part of it is because in practice, by the time you make enough money for this effect to kick in, you really aren't able to reduce your hours like that. Now I'm going to stop the presentation here because, again, this lecture is getting a little long, and we'll continue on at the next section in the in our next course, next lecture video.